Hello and welcome to Kilmainham Courthouse. Today, the 3rd of October, is actually a very significant date in the history of this building because this courthouse opened in 1820 on the 3rd of October. So today is the 200th anniversary of the opening of this building. Now, this building, although it's referred to now as Kilmainham Courthouse, was originally called the Session House because it had both a judicial function as a courthouse, but it was also the headquarters of the Grand Jury of Dublin, which would have been, I suppose, the equivalent of the County Council today, and would have had control over local government affairs at the time. So we're going to do this in two parts, and the first part is just going to look at that perhaps lesser known part of the function of the building, that the idea that this was also the headquarters of the Grand Jury of Dublin. So we're going to go to the entrance which was known as the Grand Jury entrance. So if you just want to come with me this way. As you can see, a very grand entrance, because I suppose, as the name suggests, the Grand Jury were a very grand group of people, and this is their private entrance into the building. So the Grand Jury were made up of, I suppose, the great and the good of the county. So they would have been kind of wealthy landowners or important professionals. So this wasn't really an elected body in any sense. But as I said, they did have control over the county of Dublin, so everywhere in the county except outside the city limits. And it was a big deal, I think, for them to get this session house built. So if you want to come with me, we'll go and explore another part of this history, just through the store here. So, having come through the entrance hall of the Grand Jury, we now find ourselves at the private stairs, which was for the exclusive use of the Grand Jury. So, effectively, nearly half the building was given over to them. Interestingly, there's earlier plans from about 1817 for another scheme for the session house in Kilmainham Jail. It was a much grander plan and would have seen a lot more space given over to the Grand Jury. So I suppose it gives you a sense of their influence and control at the time. That was abandoned, as I said, and then in 1820 this building that we have here opened. It's designed by an architect called William Farrell. It's somewhat unusual still, though, insofar as there's only one courtroom in the building. And in most courthouses around the country, you'd have two, one for civil cases, one for criminal. But in the case of Kilmainham, there's just one. And as I said, the area given over to the Grand Jury was particularly impressive. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go inside what was referred to as the Grand Jury's room. So this was the Grand Jury's room for their exclusive use. It's now, as you can see, part of our cafe, which is currently closed, of course. And for the day that's in it, we're going to have a look at this remarkable plaque here on the wall, which commemorates the opening of the session house on the 3rd of October 1820. And you can see there the chairman of His Majesty's Council at Law, the High Sheriff, the Sub-Sheriff, and also the oath which members of the Grand Jury had to take. And then below it we see the Grand Jury from 1820, the great and the good of Dublin County, and not necessarily the most democratic or representative group of individuals. Most notably, of course, they're all men. But in the corner you can see here that the architect of the building, William Farrell, is acknowledged. And then there's a very interesting intervention. So originally this would have said, God save the King, but you can see that at a certain point somebody has decided to scratch that out rather forcibly, probably during the period after independence, but you never know. But it's interesting, we'll be seeing another example of that kind of activity later in the video. So this did once say God Save the King, and the king they're referring to in 1820 is George IV. He'd actually effectively been ruler for many years. He was Prince Regent after his father, George III, went mad. But his father died in 1820, in January of 1820, so he took over then. He was very unpopular, not just in Ireland, but also in England and Scotland and lots of other places, principally, I think, because of his bad behaviour towards his wife, Caroline of Brunswick. And on the 30th of December 1820, the Sheriff of Dublin decided, I think, to kind of curry some favour with the Crown and the administration here in Dublin, and the British administration rather, and he called a meeting of the freeholders of Dublin, and the purpose of this meeting was to make a loyal address to George IV. However, other people had other ideas, most notably Daniel O'Connell. At first, the sheriff tried to exclude O'Connell's supporters from the meeting. He actually got soldiers to bar people's entry into the building, but they managed to gain access through a window, apparently. And when he tried to force through this loyal address, they in turn tried to elect their own chairman, so it would be an independent meeting. The sheriff responded by sending in the soldiers to break the meeting up. And apparently they were forced out of the building, but they reconvened their now independent meeting somewhere across the road on the street, and apparently somebody brought out a chair for Lord Cloncurry, who they elected as the chairman of their alternative dissident meeting for him to sit upon. So we're just going to go through here. As I mentioned, the function of the grand jury was in many ways a civic function, so they would have had responsibility for all kinds of things in County Dublin, including the running of Kilmainham Jail, and that would have continued up until the 1870s. But they did also have a judicial function, so we'll take a quick peek here into what was known as the grand jury balcony or box, and you can see there just above the judge and the jury in the courtroom proper, because their judicial function, in many ways similar to what a grand jury does in the United States up to today, they would have deemed if there was sufficient evidence for a case to be answered against the accused. So this building would have been the headquarters of the Grand Jury of County Dublin up until 1898. And even when they set up the County Council, initially the County Council for County Dublin still had their headquarters here in Kilmainham. But before we finish with this, I suppose this first half where we look at this building as the home of the Grand Jury in County Dublin, I thought it might be interesting to look at this more modern intervention which was added by the Office of Public Works to facilitate the incorporation of the courthouse into Kilmainham Jail Museum and its use, I suppose, as a place to receive visitors. When the architects looked at this building, what they noticed was that certainly on the first floor where we are now, there was very limited communication between the two sides, between the east side, where we've been having a look today, where the Grand Jury had their headquarters and had their entrance, and the west side, which is where the courthouse was located and which had, I suppose, more kind of judicial functions. And I think in many ways that's quite interesting in terms of understanding how this building operated. As I said at the beginning of the video, it's not just a courthouse, and in many ways it's probably best to describe it as a kind of an amalgam of both courthouse and town hall. And in the next half, we're going to have a look at I suppose, the more conventionally understood function of this building, the judicial function of it as a courthouse. So join us for part 2. So in this part of our video, we're going to look at, I suppose, the more well-known aspect of this building, the fact that it was the courthouse for Kilmainham and for much of County Dublin. Just before we go in, we can see the facade here designed by William Farrell in 1820. Just above you can see the Royal Coat of Arms. You'll notice something is missing. The crown has been removed. That was removed actually in the 1930s. The authorities at the time were worried that there had been attacks on symbols of British and royal authority in Ireland at the time, and they were afraid that the attack on this building, so they decided rather than remove the whole thing, they would just take the crown off. And sometimes I liken it to the if you had a bomb and you decided to just defuse it by taking out one key component. And without the crown, then I suppose it's just kind of an interesting echo of history. So we're going to head in, and this was the entrance that was used by people attending the court. So we'll just come into the very impressive entrance hall, a lot quieter than outside. And you can just look up there, there's the bridge that was added in 2016 for the adaptation of this building as part of Kilmainham Jail Museum. But we're just going to head inside. Now, if you had come to Kilmainham Courthouse in 1820, when it first opened, when it looked as William Farrell envisaged it to look, you would actually have been in the courthouse at this stage. This hall was in many ways added afterwards, and a lot of the design of the court today owes its origin to a refurbishment that was done in 1865 by John McCurdy. That name might be familiar to some of you because John McCurdy was also responsible for the new East Wing in Kilmainham Jail and lots of other significant adaptations to Kilmainham Jail in the 1860s. He was also responsible for the refurbishment of the Shelburne Hotel. And as part of his refurbishments, we believe that the ground level was raised here, so you can see we came up some steps. And he would have had tiered seating behind here. That was removed. We don't know exactly when that was removed. But this, I suppose, if you were just coming into the court, this is what you would have been faced with. Over the judge's seat, there would have been a canopy. And certainly there's images of this courtroom up until the 1980s where that canopy still seems to have been in place. There was some kind of curtain arrangement. You can get a good sense of it here in this engraving, showing perhaps the most famous trial that took place here, the trial of the Invincibles in 1883. Now this was in many ways their pre-trial. The actual trials in which they were convicted and sentenced to death, they took place in Green Street Courthouse. At a certain point, Kilmainham was deemed too small. But this would have been the site of some very dramatic moments in that trial when particularly when James Carey, who was the leader of the group, decided to turn against his comrades and testify against them. And they would have found that out literally in the courtroom. So I'm sure it was a very dramatic moment. Just up there you can see the Grand Jury box up above the hoi polloi. And then just behind us you can see these steps which lead down to some holding cells in the basement of the courthouse. Now, originally the dock where the accused would have sat or stood would have been in and around this area. They would have come up from those cells into the dock. But in the 1960s, the Department of Justice in Ireland ordered that all docks be removed. So we don't have that particular area of the courthouse anymore. The court continued until 1911. Interesting, around the same time that Kilmainham Jail closed, it closed, but it reopened in 1924. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to head upstairs and we're going to have a look at the courthouse from above and kind of get a sense of the different functions of different areas of the courthouse. The other thing that I'm kind of anxious to have a look at is the fact that there's a second set of stairs, not quite as grand as the ones for the Grand Jury, but certainly impressive enough. So these would have been used by court officials, etc. But again, it's really interesting just to see how separate these two sides of the building are. As I mentioned earlier, there's a new bridge to, I suppose, connect them a little bit better. So we just head in here and you can get kind of a bird's eye view of the courthouse. So Grand Jury on one side, Petit Jury, coming from the French meaning petit or small, jury on the other. And then you can see the judge's chair. Up above him is the Irish harp. Of course, in the 19th century, that would have been the royal insignia. And actually, we have the crown from the canopy that used to sit above the judge. And then a really interesting and kind of curious piece of Irish judicial history. You have the witness table. So that chair there is there for a very deliberate reason, because that is where witnesses would have sat to give their testimony. So you can see it's very dramatic, very theatrical. All focus would have been on the witness when they were testifying. I suppose even today, court cases tend to have a kind of a flair for the dramatic. This court continued to operate until 2008. It was a district court, so in many ways wouldn't have had too many, I suppose, high-profile cases, but you would have had lots of kind of arraignments and hearings of people involved in very, I suppose, notorious crimes in the 20th century. And as I said, within, of course, living memory up until 2008, it was still a working court. So that's it for this second part of the video, looking at, I suppose, the judicial functions of the courthouse. We'll be doing a few more kind of smaller ones, looking at different little aspects of the courthouse over the coming week to mark the bicentenary of the opening of this building. Until then, stay safe and we'll talk to you soon.